The gold rush of the mid-1800s wasn't just a story of fortune and discovery. It was a whirlwind of chaos, greed, and profound suffering. Imagine the deafening roar of shovels piercing the earth, the thunderous rush of thousands of feet trampling across pristine lands, each step unwittingly erasing centuries of history, culture, and traditions that had been safeguarded by the Native American tribes. As these hopeful settlers pushed westward in search of the precious yellow metal, they unleashed a catastrophic wave that would ripple across the American landscape, forever changing the lives of the indigenous peoples who had called these regions home for countless generations. What was the true price of this glittering promise, you ask? It was a tale soaked in blood, tears, and the slow but steady erosion of a way of life. It all began in 1848 when James W. Marshall's accidental discovery of tiny flakes of gold in the American River at Sutter's Mill, California, set off a chain of events no one could have anticipated. In that moment, the future of California, and indeed the nation, changed forever. People, driven by dreams of untold wealth, flocked to the West. Some abandoned their homes without a second thought, selling everything they owned just for a chance to strike it rich. Families were torn apart as husbands and fathers ventured into the unknown, while others packed their entire lives into wagons, braving treacherous trails or perilous sea voyages. All believed the same lie, the promise that the land of California would make them rich beyond their wildest dreams. But as waves of gold-hungry settlers crashed into California, they did not come alone. Their arrival marked the start of a deadly new chapter for the Native American tribes that had thrived in these lands for millennia. The Miwok, Maidu, and Yurok tribes, among many others, lived in harmony with the land, treating every rock, every tree, and every stream with reverence. To them, nature was alive, every element possessed a spirit that needed to be respected. Yet, their peaceful existence was about to be shattered as disease, greed, and violence swept through their lands like a wildfire. Before long, these tribes were no longer trading peacefully with the settlers. What had begun as a mutual exchange of goods and knowledge quickly spiraled into a nightmare. The sheer number of newcomers overwhelmed their communities. Diseases like smallpox and measles, to which the indigenous population had no immunity, swept through their villages, decimating entire tribes. With each passing day, their numbers dwindled, their strength weakened, and their ability to resist the encroaching settlers faded. As if disease wasn't enough, the miners' insatiable thirst for gold brought environmental devastation. They tore open the earth, dredging rivers and poisoning waters with toxic mercury, all in the name of profit. The mercury seeped into the rivers and lakes, poisoning fish and rendering water supplies toxic. What was once a land of life became a death trap. Yet, as the settlers grew richer, the Native American tribes became increasingly destitute. Their sacred lands were stolen right from under their feet, often through violence or fraudulent treaties. Whole communities were uprooted, driven from the lands they had cherished for generations. Some were sent to missions or reservations, others were enslaved, and still others were brutally murdered. Children were ripped from their families, sold like livestock, boys for $60 and girls for $200. Those who survived were sent to government or church-run boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their traditions. The boarding schools were little more than labor camps where indigenous children were exploited, forced to work in fields, homes, and businesses. The goal was clear: erase their identities, strip away their cultures, and turn them into something else, something more acceptable to the white settlers. As the gold fever spread, so did the violence. The Native American tribes, pushed to the brink of extinction, fought back, but their resistance was often met with overwhelming force. Wars erupted, the most significant being the Mariposa War of 1850. It began when miners discovered gold in the Sierra Nevada foothills, on land traditionally occupied by the Ahuanichi, a band of the southern Sierra Miwok people. The miners moved in, claiming the land and its resources as their own. Clashes between the miners and the indigenous people escalated into a brutal and bloody war, culminating in the U.S. government's intervention, which ultimately led to the forceful displacement of the Ahuanichi from their homeland. It was a pattern that would repeat itself again and again as gold was discovered in other parts of the West. Another tragic conflict was the Modoc War of 1872, also known as the Lava Beds War. This brutal conflict between the Modoc people and the U.S. Army played out in the harsh landscape of northeastern California and southeastern Oregon. Like the Ahuanichi, the Modoc people were defending their ancestral lands, but they, too, were eventually displaced. The U.S. government had made a habit of intervening in these conflicts, not to protect the Native American tribes, but to safeguard the interests of the settlers and miners. Soldiers were deployed, forts were built, and treaties were signed, often under duress or through deceit. These treaties, which promised protection and resources to the tribes, were rarely honored. Instead, they were used to confine the tribes to reservations, stripping them of their freedom and further limiting their access to the lands they had called home for generations. The impact of the gold rush on Native American tribes was devastating. Communities that had once thrived were reduced to struggling remnants of their former selves, confined to reservations with little or no resources. Their cultures, languages, and identities were systematically eroded, leaving them struggling to survive in a world that had no place for them. The loss of their land was not just a physical displacement, it was a spiritual and cultural catastrophe. Their sacred sites, hunting grounds, and homes were taken from them, severing their deep connection to the land. The scars of this era of violence, displacement, and destruction still linger today. Many Native American communities continue to fight for recognition, land rights, and the preservation of their cultures. The gold rush may have made some settlers rich, but its human cost was catastrophic. Entire cultures were brought to the brink of extinction, families were torn apart, and countless lives were lost in the relentless pursuit of gold. The promise of wealth had blinded the settlers to the suffering they inflicted upon the Native American tribes, leaving behind a legacy of pain, loss, and injustice that can never be undone. This is the true cost of the gold rush, a cost that continues to be felt by the descendants of those who lived through this dark chapter in American history. The insatiable hunger for gold and land during the mid-1800s carved deep, permanent scars into the Native American communities. These scars remain today, silent witnesses of a turbulent chapter in American history that many would prefer to forget. But the pain and suffering of those who lived through the gold rush can never truly be erased. What began as a mad scramble for riches left behind a legacy of environmental devastation, cultural obliteration, and generational trauma. The very methods that prospectors used to extract gold, hydraulic mining, dredging, and clear-cutting forests for timber, unleashed chaos on the natural landscape. Forests that had stood for centuries, providing shelter and resources for the indigenous people, were felled in a matter of years, exposing the fragile soil to the brutal forces of erosion. Rivers that had once teemed with life, rich with fish that sustained the Native American tribes, became clogged with sediment and poisoned with mercury, a toxic byproduct of the mining process. The waters turned a dull, lifeless gray, choking out the ecosystems that had once thrived along their banks. As the rivers dried up and the fish disappeared, so too did the traditional ways of life for the Native American communities. These waters were not merely sources of food, they were sacred. Ceremonies tied to the natural rhythms of the rivers, practices handed down through generations, were abruptly severed. The destruction was not just physical, it was spiritual. To lose the river was to lose a connection to the divine, a severing of the bond between people and the earth. Wildlife, too, vanished as their habitats were razed, polluted, and transformed into industrial wastelands. The biodiversity that had sustained the tribes for millennia crumbled under the relentless advance of the miners. What had once been lush, vibrant ecosystems became barren landscapes, incapable of supporting the people who had depended on them for survival. The environmental havoc caused by the gold rush had profound, long-lasting consequences. But the destruction of the land was just the beginning. Perhaps even more devastating was the destruction of the Native American culture itself. Sacred sites, places that held deep spiritual and cultural significance for the tribes, were bulldozed, mined, and built over. The spiritual loss was immeasurable. Rituals and traditions that had been performed for generations were interrupted, sometimes lost forever. The settlers who came in search of gold brought with them not just tools and weapons, but also a mindset of superiority. They viewed the Native American way of life as primitive, inferior. As a result, the tribe's customs, beliefs, and languages were systematically suppressed, dismissed, or outright destroyed. This cultural erasure was a form of violence that extended far beyond the physical. For the tribes forced onto reservations, life became an unending struggle. Confined to small, often inhospitable tracts of land, they faced poverty, disease, and a daily battle to preserve their cultural heritage. The loss of their traditional lands meant not only a loss of physical space but also a loss of identity. Their ways of life, centered around the land, were no longer possible. Farming, hunting, fishing, these were no longer viable in the harsh, restricted spaces of the reservations. Entire generations grew up without access to their ancestral lands, their cultural knowledge fading with each passing year. The long-term effects of the gold rush on Native American communities are still felt today. The legacy of displacement, environmental destruction, and cultural loss continues to reverberate through the lives of many Native Americans. Even after more than a century and a half, the demographic shifts caused by the gold rush have left lasting scars. Many tribes still grapple with high rates of poverty, limited access to resources, and ongoing legal battles over land rights. The connection between the land and the people has been forever altered, and the fight to reclaim that lost heritage is ongoing. But the story of the Native American tribes during and after the gold rush is not solely one of victimhood. It is also a story of resistance, resilience, and hope. For decades, Native American leaders have fought tirelessly for the rights of their people. They have waged legal battles to reclaim stolen lands, secure compensation for past injustices, and preserve their cultures in the face of overwhelming odds. These efforts are not just about rectifying the past, they are about ensuring a future where Native American communities can thrive once again. Take, for example, the visionary Chief White Eyes, a Delaware leader who lived during the American Revolution. He sought to form an alliance with the U.S. government in the hope of creating a state led by his people. Though his plans ultimately collapsed after his untimely death, his vision for a future where Native Americans could govern their own lands continues to inspire many today. Or consider Standing Bear, the Ponca chief who became a powerful symbol of Native American rights in the late 1800s. After the U.S. government forcibly removed his people from their lands in Nebraska to the unfamiliar and inhospitable territory of Oklahoma, Standing Bear made the courageous decision to return home. He traveled hundreds of miles to bury his son in their ancestral homeland, defying government orders that sought to confine him to the reservation. His arrest sparked a groundbreaking court case in which Standing Bear argued that Native Americans should be recognized as people under U.S. law. In a landmark ruling, the court agreed, declaring that an Indian is a person entitled to the same rights and protections as anyone else. It was a victory not just for Standing Bear, but for all Native Americans fighting for recognition and justice. Today, his legacy lives on in the form of a statue that stands in the U.S. Capitol, a reminder of his tireless fight for his people's rights. Then there is Billy Frank Jr., a Nisqually leader who spent his life fighting for the fishing rights of Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest. In the 1960s, as commercial overfishing and hydroelectric dams decimated the region's salmon populations, Frank led a movement to protect the traditional fishing practices of his people. His activism sparked a series of fish wars, protests, and legal battles that culminated in the Bolt decision of 1974, which affirmed the fishing rights of Native American tribes in Washington state. Frank's dedication to his cause did not waver, even in the face of repeated arrests, threats, and violence. By the time of his death in 2014, he had become a national symbol of environmental stewardship and indigenous rights. The gold rush may have brought wealth and opportunity to some, but for the Native American tribes, it was a time of unimaginable loss. The environmental destruction, cultural erasure, and displacement that occurred during this period are scars that have yet to heal. But within these communities, there is also a deep sense of pride and resilience. The fight to reclaim what was lost continues to this day, as Native American leaders and activists work to protect their lands, preserve their cultures, and secure a future for the next generation. The story of the gold rush is not just a story of tragedy, it is a story of survival. It is a story that speaks to the strength of the human spirit and the enduring power of community, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Frank, who had been arrested over 50 times since 1945 for his protests, remained steadfast in his belief that the Nisqually and other native nations in Washington were entitled to their fishing rights, as guaranteed by treaties. His relentless dedication caught national attention, even attracting the support of Hollywood actors. Over time, numerous Native Americans have come together to create a lasting legacy for future generations, a legacy that reconnects them with their ancestral roots and strengthens their identity. This movement, sparked by the long-term consequences of the gold rush, encompasses not only cultural revival but also environmental restoration. Cultural revival has emerged as a critical response to the lasting effects of the gold rush. Today, several tribes are working hard to reclaim their languages, customs, and traditions, which were once nearly lost. This revival serves as a vital lifeline, allowing new generations to re-establish their connection to their heritage. The efforts to recover these cultural elements are more than symbolic. They represent the healing of wounds inflicted over a century ago. Language classes are being offered, traditional dances and ceremonies are being practiced once more, and stories passed down from elders are being preserved and taught to the younger generations. Through these actions, Native American communities are not just surviving, they are thriving, building a bridge between their past and their future. Environmental restoration has also become a fundamental part of this legacy. Native American tribes have initiated projects aimed at healing the land that was so drastically altered during the gold rush. These efforts include reintroducing native species that had been driven out by environmental destruction, restoring rivers and forests to their natural states, and practicing sustainable agriculture that aligns with traditional ecological knowledge. The goal is not only to repair the damage done but also to restore the deep, spiritual connection between Native Americans and their environment. For tribes whose identities are tied so closely to the land, these restoration projects are a way of healing both the earth and their communities. The story of the gold rush is one of hardship, but it is also one of strength and recovery. The scars left by that period run deep, but the tribes affected by it are showing the world what resilience truly looks like. They are reclaiming their lands, preserving their cultures, and restoring their environments. These efforts are a testament to their strength and serve as an inspiration to younger generations, who continue the fight for justice, recognition, and preservation of their heritage. As young Native Americans grow up, they inherit not only the painful history of their ancestors but also their courage and determination to build a brighter future. Looking back at this turbulent time in history, it is crucial to honor the incredible resilience demonstrated by Native American tribes. The hardships they faced were immense, but their cultures and traditions have endured. Despite being deeply impacted by colonization, disease, displacement, and environmental destruction, these tribes have held on to the essence of who they are. Their ongoing efforts remind us of the importance of acknowledging the full weight of our history and the need to support those communities that continue to live with its consequences. As we bring this episode to a close, it's essential to remember that the story of the gold rush is not just a tale of lost gold or forgotten fortunes. It is a story of people, survival, and enduring spirit. The lessons of this period resonate today as Native American communities push forward, working to restore their lands, revitalize their cultures, and reclaim their rights. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. We hope you found this story insightful and thought-provoking. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more content that uncovers the untold stories of our past, and make sure to turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we release new episodes. Until next time, stay curious, and we'll see you in our next video.